Volume 2, Chapter 9 of The Last Man. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Madeira. The Last Man by Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. Volume 2, Chapter 9. Half England was desolate when October came, and the equinoctial wind swept over the earth, chilling the ardours of the unhealthy season. The summer, which was uncommonly hot, had been protracted into the beginning of this month, when on the 18th a sudden change was brought about from summer temperature to winter frost. Pestilence then made a pause in her death-dealing career. Gasping, not daring to name our hopes, yet full even to the brim with intense expectation, we stood as a shipwrecked sailor stands on a barren rock islanded by the ocean, watching a distant vessel, fancying that now it nears, and then again that it is bearing from sight. This promise of a renewed lease of life turned rugged natures to melting tenderness, and by contrast filled the soft with harsh and unnatural sentiments. When it seemed destined that all were to die, we were reckless of the how and when. Now that the virulence of the disease was mitigated, and it appeared willing to spare some, each was eager to be among the elect, and clung to life with dastard tenacity. Instances of desertion became more frequent, and even murders, which made the hearer sick with horror, where the fear of contagion had armed those nearest in blood against each other. But these smaller and separate tragedies were about to yield to a mightier interest, and while we were promised calm from infectious influences, a tempest arose wilder than the winds, a tempest bred by the passions of man, nourished by his most violent impulses, unexampled and dire. A number of people from North America, the relics of that populous continent, had set sail for the East with mad desire of change, leaving their native plains for lands not less afflicted than their own. Several hundreds landed in Ireland about the 1st of November, and took possession of such vacant habitations as they could find, seizing upon the superabundant food and the stray cattle. As they exhausted the produce of one spot, they went on to another. At length they began to interfere with the inhabitants, and strong in their concentrated numbers, ejected the natives from their dwellings, and robbed them of their winter's store. A few events of this kind roused the fiery nature of the Irish, and they attacked the invaders. Some were destroyed. The major part escaped by quick and well-ordered movements, and danger made them careful. Their numbers ably arranged, the very deaths among them concealed. Moving on in good order, and apparently given up to enjoyment, they excited the envy of the Irish. The Americans permitted a few to join their band, and presently the recruits outnumbered the strangers, nor did they join with them, nor imitate the admirable order which, preserved by the transatlantic chiefs, rendered them at once secure and formidable. The Irish followed their track in disorganized multitudes, each day increasing, each day becoming more lawless. The Americans were eager to escape from the spirit they had roused, and, reaching the eastern shores of the island, embarked for England. Their incursion would hardly have been felt had they come alone, but the Irish, collected in unnatural numbers, began to feel the inroads of famine, and they followed in the wake of the Americans for England also. The crossing of the sea could not arrest their progress. The harbours of the desolate seaports of the west of Ireland were filled with vessels of all sizes, from the man-of-war to the small fisher's boat, which lay sailorless and rotting on the lazy deep. The emigrants embarked by hundreds, and unfurling their sails with rude hands made strange havoc of buoy and cordage. Those who modestly betook themselves to the smaller craft, for the most part achieved their watery journey in safety. Some, in the true spirit of reckless enterprise, went on board a ship of 120 guns. The vast hull drifted with the tide out of the bay, and after many hours its crew of landsmen contrived to spread a great part of her enormous canvas. The wind took it, and while 1,000 mistakes of the helmsman made her present her head now to one point and now to another, the vast fields of canvas that formed her sails flapped with a sound like that of a huge cataract, or such as a sea-like forest may give forth when buffeted by an equinoctial north wind. The portholes were open, and with every sea, which as she lurched washed her decks, they received whole tons of water. The difficulties were increased by a fresh breeze which began to blow, whistling among the shrouds, dashing the sails this way and that, and rending them with horrid split; and such were as may have visited the dreams of Milton, when he imagined the winnowing of the arch-fiend's van-like wings, which increased the uproar of wild chaos. These sounds were mingled with the roaring of the sea, the splash of the chafed billows around the vessel's sides, and the gurgling up of the water in the hold. The crew, many of whom had never seen the sea before, felt indeed as if heaven and earth came ruining together, as the vessel dipped her bows in the waves, or rose high upon them. Their yells were drowned in the clamour of elements, and the thunder rivings of their unwieldy habitation. They discovered at last that the water gained on them, and they betook themselves to their pumps. They might as well have laboured to empty the ocean by bucketfuls. As the sun went down, the gale increased. The ship seemed to feel her danger. She was now completely waterlogged, and presented other indications of settling before she went down. The bay was crowded with vessels, whose crews for the most part were observing the uncouth sportings of this huge unwieldy machine. They saw her gradually sink, the waters now rising above her lower decks. They could hardly wink before she had utterly disappeared, nor could the place where the sea had closed over her be at all discerned. Some few of her crew were saved, but the greater part, clinging to her cordage and masts, went down with her, to rise only when death loosened their hold. This event caused many of those who were about to sail to put foot again on firm land, ready to encounter any evil rather than to rush into the yawning jaws of the pitiless ocean. But these were few, in comparison to the numbers who actually crossed. Many went up as high as Belfast to ensure a shorter passage, and then journeying south through Scotland, they were joined by the poorer natives of that country, and all poured, with one consent, into England. Such incursions struck the English with affright, in all those towns where there was still sufficient population to feel the change. There was room enough indeed in our hapless country for twice the number of invaders, but their lawless spirit instigated them to violence. They took a delight in thrusting the possessors from their houses, in seizing on some mansion of luxury where the noble dwellers secluded themselves in fear of the plague, in forcing these of either sex to become their servants and purveyors, till, the ruin complete in one place, they removed their locust visitation to another. When unopposed, they spread their ravages wide. In cases of danger they clustered, and by dint of numbers overthrew their weak and despairing foes. They came from the east and the north, and directed their course without apparent motive, but unanimously towards our unhappy metropolis. Communication had been to a great degree cut off through the paralyzing effects of pestilence, so that the van of our invaders had proceeded as far as Manchester and Derby before we received notice of their arrival. They swept the country like a conquering army, burning, laying waste, murdering. The lower and vagabond English joined with them. Some few of the Lord's lieutenant who remained endeavoured to collect the militia, but the ranks were vacant. Panic seized on all, and the opposition that was made only served to increase the audacity and cruelty of the enemy. They talked of taking London, conquering England, calling to mind the long detail of injuries which had for many years been forgotten. Such vaunts displayed their weakness, rather than their strength. Yet still they might do extreme mischief, which, ending in their destruction, would render them at last objects of compassion and remorse. We were now taught how, in the beginning of the world, mankind clothed their enemies in impossible attributes, and how details, proceeding from mouth to mouth, might, like Virgil's ever-growing rumour, reach the heavens with her brow, and clasp Hesperus and Lucifer with her outstretched hands. Gorgon and centaur, dragon and iron-hoofed lion, vast sea-monster and gigantic hydra, were but types of the strange and appalling accounts brought to London concerning our invaders. Their landing was long unknown, but having now advanced within 100 miles of London, the country people flying before them had arrived in successive troops, each exaggerating the numbers, fury, and cruelty of the assailants. Tumult filled the before quiet streets. Women and children deserted their homes, escaping they knew not whither. Fathers, husbands, and sons stood trembling, not for themselves, but for their loved and defenceless relations. As the country people poured into London, The citizens fled southwards. They